I'm Tom Friedman. I'm the Foreign Affairs columnist for the New York Times. And I'm going to talk to you this morning about my last book. It was called Thank You for Being Late. Thank you for being late. An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. And I know some of you have read it, and those of you who haven't, I know who you are. Okay, so thank you for being late. Whenever people hear the title of the book, the first question they always have is, where from comes the title? Thank you for being late. It actually comes from meeting people for breakfast in Washington, D.C., where I live. And I don't like to waste breakfast eating by myself if I'm downtown and can learn from somebody. So I often schedule business breakfasts, and every once in a while someone comes 10, 15 minutes late. And they always say, Tom, I'm really sorry. It was the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. Well, about 4 years ago, when I was just starting this book, I had scheduled a sell, and he came 15 minutes late. He did the usual, Tom, I'm really sorry. It was the weather, the traffic, the subway, the dog ate my homework. And I just spontaneously said to him, actually, Peter, thank you for being late. Because you were late, I've been eavesdropping on their conversation. Fascinating. I've been people watching the lobby. Fantastic. And best of all, I just connected two ideas I've been struggling with for a month. So thank you for being late. Well, people started to get into it. They'd say, well, you're welcome. Because they understood I was actually giving them permission to pause, to slow down, to reflect. Which is why my favorite quote from the front of the book is from my teacher and friend, Dov Seidman, who says, when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, it starts. That's when it starts to reflect, rethink, and reimagine. And boy, don't we need to be doing a lot of that right now. Now, this book was actually triggered when I paused and engaged with someone I would not normally engage with. So I actually live down the road in Bethesda, Maryland. I work out of the New York Times Washington Bureau. And I take the subway to work about once a week. And for me, that means driving from my home in Bethesda to the Bethesda Hyatt, and I park in the public parking garage beneath the Bethesda Hyatt, and I take the red line into D.C., and I did that almost 4 years ago now. Drove my car to the parking lot, got my time-stamped ticket, took the red line into D.C., spent the day at the New York Times, took the red line back, got my car time-stamped ticket, went to the cashier's booth, handed the ticket to the cashier. He looked at it and looked at me and said, I know who you are. I said, great. He said, I read your column. I thought, great, the parking guy reads my column. He said, I don't always agree. I thought, get me out of here. But I said, no, that's good. It means you always have to check. And I drove off thinking, it's great, the parking guy reads my column. A week later, I took my weekly trip into D.C., parking garage, time-stamped ticket, red line day, office, New York Times, red line back, car, time-stamped ticket, cashier's booth, same guy's there. This time he says, Mr. Friedman, I have my own blog. Would you read my blog? I thought, oh my God, the parking guy is now my competitor? What just happened? So I said, well, write it down for me and I'll look it up. So he tore off a piece of receipt paper and he wrote on it, odanambi.com. I went home immediately, fired it up on my computer. Turns out he's Ethiopian, writes about Ethiopian politics from the perspective of the Oromo people, a real democracy advocate. It was a little rough, but it wasn't bad. I thought about him for a couple days. I shared this with my wife, and I decided that this was a sign from God and that I should pause and engage this guy. But I didn't have his email, so the only way I could do that was park in the parking garage every day. So I parked in the parking garage for 4 days, and we eventually overlapped at 7 in the morning. I parked under the gate so it couldn't come down. When I went in, I got out of my car. I said to Mayile, now I know his name, Mayile Bojia, Ayile, would you give me your email? I want to send you an email. And he tore off another piece of receipt paper and gave me his email. And that evening, we began an email exchange. And they're all in the front of the book. I saved them all. They're kind of funny. I basically said to him, I have a proposition for you. I will teach you how to write a column in the New York Times if you will tell me your life story. And he basically said, I see you're proposing a deal. I like this deal. So we agreed to meet 2 weeks later at Pete's Coffee House in Bethesda. And I came with a 6-page memo on how to write a column for the New York Times. And he came with his life story. Ethiopian grad of Haile Selassie University in Addis Ababa in economics, was an activist for the Oromo people and democracy, eventually such an activist that the Ethiopian government threw him out of the country. We welcomed him here as a political refugee in exile. We used to do that. And now he is blogging. He started blogging on Ethiopian websites, he told me, but they were too slow. They wouldn't turn his stuff around fast enough. So he decided to start his own blog, and he told me, now, Mr. Friedman, I feel empowered. His Google metrics say he's read in 30 different countries. My parking attendant. It's an amazing story about how anyone today can participate in the global conversation. And he's a wonderful man, and we've remained friends. I then presented him with a 6-page memo on how to write a column for the New York Times, which I repeat in the front of the book. I basically explained to him that a news story is meant to inform. I could do a news story about your little conference here, and Wallace would tell me whether I've informed better or worse. But what I do, opinion writing, is meant to provoke. So I'm either in the heating business or the lighting business. That's what I do. I'm either doing a heating or a lighting. I'm either stoking up an emotion in you or illuminating something for you. And if I really do it well, I produce both heat and light. But to do that, I explained to Ayile, it requires actually a chemical reaction. And you have to combine 3 chemicals. First is, what is your value set? What are the set of values and principles animating your column? Are you a communist, a capitalist, a neocon, a neoliberal, a libertarian, a Marxist, a Keynesian? What is the philosophical position animating your opinions? Second, and this is going to be the thrust of my talk today, how do you think the machine works? So the machine is my shorthand for what are the biggest forces shaping more things in more places in more ways on more days. Because as a columnist, you see, I'm always carrying around in my head a working hypothesis of how the machine works. Why? Because I'm trying to take my values and push the machine in their direction. And if I don't know how the machine works, I either won't push it or I'll push it in the wrong direction. And lastly, what have you learned about people and culture? Because there's no column without people. There's no people without culture. How are different peoples and cultures affected when the machine works, and how do they come back and affect the machine? Stir those 3 together, let it rise, bake for 45 minutes, and if you do it right, you too can be a columnist in the New York Times. Well, the more I explained this to Ayile, the more I would sit back at home. I'd never done this before. And I'd say to my wife, well, if that's what a column's about, what's my value set? Those of you who read me know I'm not a conservative, but I'm not actually a liberal either. My column is actually animated by the values I learned in the small town in Minnesota where I grew up in the 50s and 60s at a time and place where politics worked. How do I think the machine works today, and what have I learned about its impact on people and culture? And that is what Thank You for Being Late is all about. The first half of the book is how the machine works. And the second half of the book is how this machine is not just changing your world, it's reshaping your world. And it's reshaping 5 realms: politics, geopolitics, ethics, yeah, we're going to talk a little ethics this morning, community, and the one you're most involved with, the workplace. So let's first talk about how the machine works. So I think what is shaping more things in more places in more ways on more days is that we're actually in the middle of 3 nonlinear accelerations all at the same time with the 3 largest forces on the planet, which I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So Mother Nature for me is climate change, biodiversity loss, and population growth in the developing world. If you put Mother Nature on a graph, she looks like a giant accelerating hockey stick. Or she looks like Glacier National Park 1913 and Glacier National Park 2012. By the way, that glacier had been there for 7,000 years. Or she looks like Lake Chad, 1963, and Lake Chad, 2013, that little blue smudge at the bottom. Or she looks like a graph of global average temperature, a giant hockey stick. Or she looks like another hockey stick, a graph of reported extreme weather. Or she looks like the mother of all hockey sticks, world population growth through history. Put Mother Nature on a graph, and she looks like just one big accelerating hockey stick. Now, the market for me is globalization, but not your grandparents' globalization. That was containers on ships and planes. That's actually pretty flat today. What is actually driving globalization today is digital globalization. Where everything's being digitized and globalized through MOOCs and PayPal and Facebook and Twitter. You put digital globalization on a graph, and it looks like another hockey stick. Total data consumed per month. Or it looks like a hockey stick, mobile cellular subscriptions in the United States or every one of your countries. Or it looks like another hockey stick, global internet users. And the last hockey stick we're in the middle of is Moore's Law. So Moore's Law was coined in 1965 by Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, who posited that the speed and power of microchips would double every 24 months and the price would remain roughly flat. Moore's Law has been alive and well since 1965, and it's still alive and well. And it looks today like the mother of all hockey sticks. Now, every year since 1965, someone has written an article, maybe one of your professors, that said, Moore's Law is over, Moore's Law is over, Moore's Law is over. And what all those people have in common is they were wrong. Moore's Law is alive and well. This PowerPoint, I didn't look at the computer, but I suspect is running on an Intel 14 nanometer chip. It has 35,000 transistors per square millimeter. Last January, Intel began shipping its 10 nanometer chip. It has 100,000 transistors, 100 million transistors per square millimeter. And Intel can tell you exactly how they're going to make their 7 nanometer chip. What's the difference between 35 million transistors and 100 million per square millimeter? Your eye can't see it. It's the difference between a self-driving car that will need the whole trunk of the car to contain the brains of the car and a self-driving car that will need just a little box under the front seat. Intel, a couple years ago, to try to explain to people the power of that acceleration because it's so abstract, assigned its engineers to take a 1971 Volkswagen Beetle and estimate what if that 1971 Volkswagen Beetle had improved at the same rate microchips had since 1971, what would it be like today? And they estimated that if it had, that VW Beetle today would go 300,000 miles an hour. It would get 2 million miles per gallon, and it would cost you 4 cents to buy. And you'd be able to drive it your entire life on a single tank of gas. That is the power of the technological exponential driving our lives in every one of your universities. Now, my argument is that these three accelerations are all interweaving with one another. And to understand the world today, you cannot think in the box. You cannot think out of the box. Today, you must think without a box. You will not understand what's going on anywhere unless you understand it as the interweaving of these three giant accelerations. Syria had a revolution, 2010, 2011. It actually began with the worst drought in Syria's modern history from 2006 to 2010, drove 1 million Syrian farmers out of their homes into the cities. They then saw the Arab Spring Revolution in Tunisia on their cell phones, and they globalized together and blew the lid off the place in 2011. You ask your Middle East Studies professors what happened in Syria, they'll tell you there was a revolution. I'll tell you that it was the interweaving of the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law all accelerating at the same time. And this interweaving is not just changing your world, it's reshaping your world. Politics, geopolitics, ethics, the community, and the workplace. So let me just say a few more words about Moore's Law, and the chapter on Moore's Law, and then we'll talk about how your world is being reshaped by that, because Moore's Law is really the mother of all these drivers. My chapter on Moore's Law is called What the Hell Happened in 2007. What the hell happened in 2007? I know what you're thinking, 2007? Such an innocuous year. What's this guy talking about? Well, here's what happened in 2007. The year was kicked off on January 9th in San Francisco at the Moscone Center when a guy named Steve Jobs introduced the first one of these things on January 9th, 2007. This is actually a handheld computer with more compute power in it than the Apollo space mission. And I'm told it doubles as a phone and a camera. That's how the year was kicked off. We put one of those in everybody's hands. We began to put one of those in everybody's hands. In 2007, a company called Facebook opened its platform to anyone with a registered email address. And Facebook in 2007 broke out of your universities and high schools and went global. In 2007, a company called Twitter split off on its own independent platform and went global. In 2007, the most important software you've never heard of, called VMware, went public. VMware is what enables any operating system to work on any computer. It's the foundation of cloud computing. In 2007, the second most important software you've never heard of, called Hadoop, named after the founder's son's toy elephant, was launched into the wild. Hadoop is what enables 1 million computers to work together as if they're one. I think they call that big data. Hadoop didn't invent those algorithms. They're actually invented by Google. They're called GFS and MapReduce. But as Doug Cutting, the founder of Hadoop, explains in my book, Google lives in the future and sends us letters back home. And what Google did was leave a trail of breadcrumbs for the open source computing community to reverse engineer their big data algorithm, and they turned it into a free public version called Hadoop that every one of your universities is running in the background. In 2007, the third most important software you've never heard of, called GitHub, opened its doors. GitHub today is the largest repository of open source software with 15 million users. And for the techies among you, you'll get a kick out of the fact that this open source software giant platform was recently bought by Microsoft. In 2007, a company called Google bought a little-known TV company called YouTube. And in 2007, Google launched into the wild its own operating system. They called it Android. In 2007, a guy up in Seattle named Jeff Bezos launched the world's first ebook reader. He called it the Kindle. In 2007, a company called IBM launched the world's first cognitive computer. They called it Watson. In 2007, the internet, late 2006 actually, crossed 1 billion users, seemed to have been a turning point. In 2007, an obscure, anonymous Japanese cryptocurrency expert wrote an essay launching a cryptocurrency called Bitcoin. In 2007, 3 design students in San Francisco were attending the design conference that year. And they noticed all the hotel rooms were sold out. But one of them had 3 spare air mattresses. And they thought it would be cool if they rented their spare air mattresses out to people who couldn't get hotel rooms at the design conference. And it worked out so well for them. In 2007, they started a company called Airbnb. Yeah, that's where the name comes from the founding 3 air mattresses. In 2007, something else happened. That's a graph of the cost of sequencing a human genome. You'll notice it was $100 million here at the University of Maryland in 2001. Then it fell to $10 million in 2006. And then you'll notice it goes over a cliff like an EKG heading for a heart attack down to $10,000 in 2007. In 2007, solar energy took off, as did a process for extracting natural gas from tight shale called fracking. Between 2006 and 2008, America's total natural gas reserves increased by 35%. That's a staggering number in an 18-month period. This is a graph of social networks. So that white line going down, that's the cost of generating a megabit of data. You'll notice the line collapses from $8 to $2 a megabit in 2007. The blue line is the speed of transmitting that data. The two lines cross in 2008. That's close enough for government work. Oh, my favorite, a graph of cloud computing. What year do we first get substantive data? 2008. Means the cloud was born in 2007. In 2007, Intel, for the first time, went off silicon to extend Moore's law. It actually introduced non-silicon materials into its microchips. In 2005, Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, retired. And in 2007, he decided he better come back to work. Friends, I believe we will understand in time that 2007 was one of the greatest technological inflection points since Gutenberg invented the printing press. And we all completely missed it. Why? Because of 2008. Yeah, right when our physical technologies took off, like we're on a moving sidewalk in an airport that suddenly overnight went from 5 to 50 miles an hour, right when that happened, all of our social technologies, all of the learning reform, management reform, regulatory reform, governing reform you would want with such a giant acceleration in technology, that all froze because we entered the deepest recession since 1929. And in that gap between what happened to our physical technologies and what happened to our social technologies, oh, many Trump and Brexit voters were born because a whole bunch of people got completely dislocated in that gap. One of the people I profiled in my book is Sebastian Thrun, who founder of Udacity. Some of you are familiar, I'm sure, with Udacity, the online learning platform. When Google released its machine learning algorithm, TensorFlow, Udacity had a course up on it, a computer science course up on it, in 30 days. How many of your schools had a course up on TensorFlow in 30 days? I was just out to see Sebastian last week. He told me that TensorFlow 2.0 was just released, and Udacity had a course up on it the next day. In fact, they co-created it with Google. That's what happens when your physical technologies take off and your social technologies don't. So what basically happened in 2007? So that little computer there, like all computers, has 5 key components. It's got a Moore's law processor. It's got a storage chip. It's got networking. It's got software, and it's got a sensor. It's got a camera. And what I do in my book is I actually trace the history of all 5. And I show how they all melded together right around 2007 into this thing we call the cloud. The cloud. But I never use the term the cloud in my book because it sounds so fluffy, so soft, so cuddly, so benign. Sounds like a Joni Mitchell song. I've looked at clouds from both sides. This ain't no cloud, folks. This is what I call in my book a supernova. The science students among you will know the supernova is the largest force in nature. It's the explosion of a star. Because what happened in 2007 was an explosion of energy into the hands of men, women, and machines, the likes of which we've simply never experienced. And it changed 4 kinds of power overnight. First, it changed the power of one. What one person can do today as a maker or a breaker is like anything we've ever seen in the history of the world. We have a president who can sit in his pajamas in the West Wing of the White House and tweet directly to 1 billion people around the planet without an editor, libel lawyer, or filter. or brain, but that's everything. But if you want to know what's really scary, is that the head of ISIS can do the exact same thing from his bunker in Raqqa province in Syria. The power today to be a maker or a breaker is unlike anything we've seen before. The power of machines have changed. Machines are now acquiring all 5 senses. No member of our species has lived in a world where machines had all 5 senses. We crossed that line on February 2011, on, of all places, a game show. There were 3 contestants. 2 were the all-time Jeopardy champions. And the 3rd contestant simply went by his last name, Mr. Watson, which was an IBM cognitive computer. Now, Mr. Watson toyed around with the humans on the first question. He let them answer it just to get their confidence up. But then he buzzed in before them on the second question. See if you can get it. The question was, it's worn on the foot of a horse and used by a dealer in a casino. And in under 2.5 seconds, Mr. Watson said in perfect Jeopardy style and computer-generated voice, "What is a shoe?" What is a shoe? And for the first time, we got to watch a cognitive computer solve a pun riddle faster than 2 human beings. And the world kind of hasn't been the same since. We've changed the power of flows. Ideas now flow, congeal, reform faster than ever before. In the old days, what did you want? You wanted a lot of stocks. You wanted stocks of everything. Stocks of knowledge at your universities, stocks of resources in your countries. That's how you got rich. Now you get rich by being in touch with the flow. Where did you want to build your town in the Middle Ages? You wanted to build it on a river, because it was the flow of the river brought you food and transport and power and ideas. You wanted to build your town on the Amazon. Where do you want to build your town today? On Amazon.com. You want to build it on the digital flows, because it's flows and being in touch with them, not stocks that are going to drive your countries and universities forward. And lastly, it's changed the power of many. Because when men, women, and machines get this super empowered, we become the largest forcing function on and in the natural world, which is why the new climate era has been named for us, the Anthropocene. Now, these 4 changes in power, they're not just changing your world. They're reshaping your world. And they're reshaping 5 realms: the workplace, politics, geopolitics, ethics, and community. I'll talk a little about them, and then we'll save some time for questions. So let's talk about the workplace. Before we do, I want to show you this little graph I made up. When I was working on the book, I went out to see my friend Astro Teller. Astro runs Google X, Google's research arm. His title is Chief Astronaut. I went out and showed my thesis to Astro, and he got up in the middle of our conversation. He went over to his whiteboard, and he took out 3 magic markers, and he drew this little graph. So the blue line across the middle, that's the average rate at which all your universities adapt to change over time, and your communities and your students. You'll notice it has a positive slope, but it's very gradual. The white line there, that's technology. So you'll notice it's very flat over here. That's because in the Middle Ages, technology didn't change that much. You could go a whole century and your bow and arrow didn't change. There was no bow and arrow 2.0 in the 12th century. But then we got this scientific revolution, Copernicus and Galileo, and eventually Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Intel, and the line starts to go straight north. And then Astro drew that little diamond there. And I said, "What's that, Astro?" He said, "Oh, Tom, that's where we are. We're at a point where technology is accelerating faster than the average human being can adapt to." Then he went out and got another magic marker, and he drew that little dotted line there. I said, "What's that, Astro?" He said, "That's learning faster and governing smarter, lifting the slope of adaptation to meet technology where it's going." And that's the business every one of you is in, or needs to be. That's the business every company leader, every educator, every parent needs to be, and how do we lift the adaptation line to meet technology where it's going. So my chapter on the workplace is called How Do We Turn AI into IA? How do we take artificial intelligence and turn it into intelligent assistance, ANCE, intelligent assistance, ANTS, and intelligent algorithms so more people can learn faster and govern smarter? It is the central political question of our time, I believe. So let me give you an example of each one. My example of intelligent assistance is the HR department, human resource department at AT&T, giant telecom, 300,000 employees, competing in the global telecom space, hyper-competitive, pretty good chance that whatever is going on in the HR department at AT&T is coming to a university near you. So what's going on today in HR at AT&T? Well, they begin their year with their president, Randall Stephenson, giving a pretty radically transparent speech about where AT&T is going that year, what businesses it will be in, and what skills you need to be a rising employee at AT&T that year. Then they put all their managers, 110,000 people, on their own in-house LinkedIn system. So I'm in there. Tom Friedman shows my education, shows what jobs I've had before at AT&T, what skills I've learned. Then it matches that up with another set of skills that they've determined. I'm going to make up the number 10. 10 skills you need to be a rising employee at AT&T that year. Then they cross-reference them. It turns out I've got 7 of the 10, but I'm missing 3. Then they partnered with Sebastian Thrun from Udacity, and he created online nano-degree courses for all 10 skill sets. Then they came to me and said, Tom, here's the deal. We will give you up to $8,000 a year to take the nano-degree courses for the skill sets you're missing. Oh, we heard you're interested in computer science. We just created a 1-year, $6,000 a year online master's degree in computer science with Georgia Tech. We'll pay for that as well. We heard you're interested in the Middle East. We've got a course on archaeology. We'll pay for that as well. Just one condition, Mr. Tom. You have to take these courses at night, at home, on weekends, on your own time, not on company time. Now, if I say to them, you know, Mr. AT&T, I've actually climbed up one too many telephone poles. I'm really not interested in spending my weekends doing nano-degree courses. They now have a wonderful severance package for me. But I will not be working at AT&T much longer. What is AT&T's social contract with their employees? Very simple. You can be a lifelong employee at AT&T still, but only if you're a lifelong learner. If you are not ready to be a lifelong learner, you will no longer be a lifelong employee at AT&T, and that is the social contract coming to a neighborhood near you. Which is why my teacher, Heather McGowan, likes to say, Mom, Dad, never ask your kids what you want to be when you grow up. Because whatever it is, not going to be here unless it's policeman or fireman. Only ask your kid how you want to be when you grow up. Will you have an agile learning mindset? Will you be predisposed to be a lifelong learner? Because that is the single most important competitive advantage today. And that leads to another conclusion, which I think is the real thing freaking people out. And that's something I learned from another of my teachers, Marina Gorbis. Marina likes to say, if I were giving this talk to this group, had Wallace invited me here 15 years ago, you know what we'd be talking about? We'd be talking about the digital divide. America's got internet. Many countries in the developing world don't. Baltimore's got internet. Upstate Maryland doesn't. There was a digital divide, and it was really important if you couldn't be connected. Today, the digital divide is disappearing. It's going to be gone in 10 years. I'm pretty sure about that, if not sooner. And when that happens, the most important divide in the world is going to be the self-motivation divide. Whose kids have the self-motivation to be lifelong learners long after they've left home, and mom and dad are not there to say, Wallace, have you done your homework? Because the old model of I go to school and I learn, then I work, then I retire is completely gone. Now it's I learn, I work, I learn, I work, I learn, I work, and increasingly you will work to learn. You know who your biggest competitor is going to be? Brandon Bastide of Kaplan just wrote about it this week. I'll tell you who your biggest competitor is going to be. Companies that are going to hire kids out of high school, right out of high school, and they're going to work and hopefully partner with you to learn at the same time. Love that Maryland t-shirt, love to have it, but basically rather have a job, because when the pace of change is accelerating so fast, you can only learn by working. And I think this whole model is going to really begin to change. That's my example of intelligent assistants. My example of intelligent assistant is the maintenance department at Qualcomm, another company I wrote about. Qualcomm actually made the inside of your iPhone, both the chips and the software. That's why Apple is always suing Qualcomm, you may have noticed. So they have a 64-building campus in San Diego, and 3 years ago, they took 6 buildings and they put sensors everywhere. Every light, every door, every window, every heating, cooling, computer system, pipe, faucet, and drain. Then they beamed all that data up to the cloud, and then they beamed it down on an iPad with an incredibly friendly user interface for their janitorial staff. So if I leave my computer on at night or a pipe bursts above my head, the janitor knows it before I do. And all they need to do is swipe down and see how to fix it or who to call. Qualcomm turned their janitors into maintenance technologists. Their janitors now give tours to foreign visitors. What do you think that does for the dignity of a janitor? Because he or she now has an intelligent assistant enabling them to learn faster and operate smarter. My example of intelligent algorithm is one you're all familiar with. The partnership between the College Board, the people who administer the PSAT and SAT exams, and Khan Academy, the online learning platform. So you all know the story. It's gotten a lot of attention lately. In 11th grade, our kids take the PSAT, the practice SAT exam, to see if they can get into University of Maryland in math and verbal. And we also know, in preparation for the SAT in 12th grade, and we also know that parents who can afford to will go out and hire a tutor for $200 an hour, in the case of a fellow in China, $6.5 million, to get their kids improved math and reading scores. Nothing illegal about it at all, except if you're paying $6.5 million. But a completely rigged game. Completely rigged game. Because if you come from a neighborhood or family that cannot afford a $200 an hour Kaplan tutor, you're at a real disadvantage. So 4 years ago, Khan Academy and the College Board created an online learning algorithm for free SAT and PSAT prep. The way it works now is in 11th grade, I take the PSAT exam. I get the results back. It says, Tom. You did really well in verbal. You could be a journalist. But you have a problem with math. In fact, specifically, Tom, you have a problem with fractions and right angles. It then takes me to a practice site, this intelligent algorithm, just for fractions and right angles, my specific weakness. If I do well there, it takes me to another site that says, Tom, you could be in AP Math. Moi? In AP Math? No one in my family's been in AP Math. No one in my neighborhood's. Yeah, you could be in AP Math. If I do well there, it takes me to another site with, last I checked, 180 college scholarships. Last year, 3.2 million American kids got free PSAT and SAT prep on this intelligent algorithm. So those are just a few ways, I have many more, of how people are learning to turn AI into IA to lift this line. Now, I usually say to audiences, I wouldn't say it here, that I'll bet none of you have ever heard of any of these things. That's because you've been following our politics. And if you follow our politics, you'll notice it's not about any of this. So let's talk about how politics is being reshaped. So you may have also noticed that political parties all over the world are blowing up. The British Labour Party's pretty much blown up. It's become a Marxist party. The Tories have completely blown up. The Republicans have blown up. They used to be for deficit control and free trade. They're now a Trump party. The Democrats will blow up as soon as they get their hands on power. The French are ruled by a guy who comes from a party that never existed before. France is, in fact, the only country in the world that's ruled by a leader with no followers and an opposition with no leader. Italy is ruled by two parties that never existed before, basically. Every party in the industrialized world has pretty much blown up. Why is that? It's because in a slow world, all these parties used to be built on 5 very stable binary choices. Big government versus small government. High regulation, low regulation. Capital versus labor. Open to free trade, closed. Open to immigration, closed. Social norms to be embraced, gay marriage, transgender rights, social norms to be banned. And green versus growth. She just lined up those 6 or 7 principles, and you could just see how every party either lined up with one line or the other. And it was true for 50 years before the age of acceleration. Because this age of acceleration is blowing up the whole list. Let's say I'm a steel worker in Pittsburgh, and I'm a member of the steel union, Monday to Friday. Who am I with? I'm with labor, baby. Labor, Bernie, I got the burn, okay? Monday to Friday. But on Saturday, I drive for Uber. And on Sunday, I rent out my kid's spare bedroom on Airbnb to pick up a little loose change. And then in the afternoon, I shop at Walmart for the cheapest made Chinese goods, and what I can't find there, I buy from a chatbot on Amazon.com. On weekends, I'm with capital. I don't want any government regulation at all. Which party am I in? It's all completely messed up. Monday to Friday, I want government regulation. I'm with unions. Saturday and Sunday, I don't want any unions, regulations interfering with me at all. So these accelerations have completely blown up the set of binary choices that governed our lives. In a sense, we're in the middle of 3 climate changes at once. We're in the middle of the change of the climate, just to reframe my thesis. We're going from later to now. So when I was growing up in Minnesota in the 50s, later was when I could clean that river, purify that lake, rescue that orangutan. I can do it now, I can do it later. Today, later is officially over. Later will now be too late. So whatever you're going to save, please save it now. That is a climate change. We're going through a change in the climate of globalization. We're going from a world that was interconnected to a world that's interdependent. And that's a very different world. In an interdependent world, you get a geoeconomic inversion. First of all, your friends start to be able to kill you faster than your enemies. You know, if Greek and Italian banks had gone under last night, I might have had to call Wallace and say, Wallace, I can't come tomorrow. Wait a minute, Greece, Italy, they're in NATO, they're in the EU, they're allies. They can kill me in an interdependent world. And in an interdependent world, your rival falling can become more dangerous than your rival rising. Had China taken 6 more islands in the South China Sea last night, don't tell anybody, couldn't care less. Had China lost 6% growth last night, Wallace would have been calling me to cancel the meeting. China can hurt us much more by falling than by rising in an interdependent world. And lastly, we're going through a change in the climate of business, because every company today can and therefore must sensorize, capture all their data, analyze that data using big data to find the needle in the haystack of their data as the norm, not the exception, optimize off that data, prophesize off that data, customize off that data, localize off that data, socialize off that data, and digitize and automatize off that data. Every business today and university is going through an incredible climate change. We're going through 3 climate changes at once. What do you want when the climate changes? You want 2 things. You want resilience. You need to be able to take a blow, because stuff happens when the climate changes. But you also want propulsion. You want to be able to move ahead at the same time. You don't be curled up under this table with me saying, Wallace, come out. The climate change is over. That's not going to work. So I thought about that, and I thought, well, who do I go to for advice on how you get resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? And then I realized I knew this woman. She was 3.8 billion years old. Her name was Mother Nature, and she dealt with more climate changes than anybody. So I called her up, made an appointment, and went out to see her. I said, Mother Nature, how do you produce resilience and propulsion when the climate changes? She said, well, Tom, I have to tell you, everything I do unconsciously, but these are my strategies. First, she said, I'm incredibly adaptive. So in my world, it's not the strongest that survive. It's not the strongest that survive. It's not the smartest that survive. It's the most adaptive that survive. And I teach that through a lesson I call natural selection. You may have heard of it. Secondly, she said, I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Wherever I see a blank space in nature, I fill it with a plant or animal perfectly adapted to that niche. I'm incredibly entrepreneurial. Third, she said, I'm incredibly pluralistic. Oh, Tom. She told me I'm the most pluralistic person you've ever met. I try 20 different species of everything. I see who wins. She told me something interesting, in fact. She told me she noticed that her most diverse ecosystems are her most resilient and propulsive ecosystems. I love pluralism, she said. Fourth, she said, I'm incredibly sustainable. Nothing is wasted. Everything is food. Eat food, poop seed. Eat food, poop seed. Nothing is wasted. Fifth, she said, I'm incredibly hybrid and heterodox in my thinking. No dogmatism for me. I'll try any trees with any soils, any bees with any flowers. Sixth, she said, I'm a lifelong learner. And I take all my learning and turn it into new DNA. Seventh, she said, I noticed that my healthiest ecosystems are all healthy because all the parts network together to build a complex adaptive network. And lastly, she said, Tom, I have to tell you, I do believe in the laws of bankruptcy. I kill all my failures. I return them to the great manufacturer in the sky, and I take their energy to nourish my successes. So my argument is that the company, the country, the university that most closely mirrors Mother Nature's strategies for building resilience and propulsion when the climate changes is actually the one that will thrive in the age of acceleration. And since I was writing my book in 2016, I created Mother Nature's political party. I turned those principles actually into a political platform and imagined what if Mother Nature were running against Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Of course, it's just a proxy for my own politics. Sometimes people say, oh, Friedman, you're a centrist. No, I'm not a centrist. That implies that I'm kind of mush between your right and left. I'm actually not even on your grid anymore. I'm looking at politics through a completely different grid. Let me just talk about a couple of realms very quickly. That'll leave us some time for questions that you may not have thought about that are also being reshaped. The first is ethics. Ethics, oh yeah. Ethics is being reshaped in the age of acceleration. So my chapter on ethics is called, Is God in Cyberspace? Is God in cyberspace? Best question I ever got on book tour, 1999. I was selling my book, Lexus and the Olive Tree, first book about globalization. I was in Portland, Oregon, speaking at the Portland Theater. Come to question time. Young man stood up in the high balcony and said, Mr. Friedman, I have a question. Is God in cyberspace? I said, I have no idea. And I felt like a complete idiot. So I got home, I called my spiritual teacher. He happens to be a rabbi I got to know when I was the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem. Brilliant Talmudic scholar named Tzvi Marks. Now lives in Amsterdam, married to a Dutch priest, interesting character. I tracked him down in Amsterdam. I said, Tzvi, I got a question I've never had before. Is God in cyberspace? What should I have answered? And he said, well, Tom, in our faith tradition, we actually have two concepts of the Almighty. We have a biblical tradition and a post-biblical tradition. The biblical tradition says the Almighty is almighty, and he smites evil and rewards good. And if that's your view of God, he sure isn't in cyberspace, which is full of pornography, gambling, cheating, lying, prevarication, people smearing one another on Twitter, and now we know fake news. But fortunately, he said, we have a post-biblical view of God. And the post-biblical view of God says God manifests himself by how we behave. So if we want God to be in cyberspace, we have to bring him there by how we behave there. Only we can bring God into cyberspace. Well, I really liked his answer, and I put it into the paperback edition of Lexis Neolatry, which came out in the year 2000, where none of you saw it, and it sat there for 16 years. I started writing this book, and I started retelling that story. And I finally sat myself down one day and said, why are you retelling that story? And the answer became immediately obvious. It was for two reasons, and one just happened. The one that just happened is that I think in the developed world, probably in the developing world too, in many places, we've begun living 51% of our lives in cyberspace. Yeah, that's where you go now to find a date, find a spouse, do your learning, do your banking, do your brokerage, buy a car, do your travel, read a book, buy a book, sell a book, make a book. We're living 51% of our lives in cyberspace. And what's my definition of cyberspace? It's a realm where we're all connected and no one's in charge. We're all connected, but no one's in charge. You may have noticed there are no stoplights in cyberspace. No rules, no regs, no 1-800, please stop Putin from hacking my election. But that's where you're living 51% of your life. In fact, you're living 51% of your life in a realm that is fundamentally God-free. And at the same time, because of my accelerations, we're now standing at a moral intersection no member of our species has ever stood at before. In 1945, we entered a world where one country could kill all of us, post-Hiroshima. I think we're entering a world where one person can kill all of us. And at the same time, where all of us could actually fix everything. We've actually never been here before, where one of us could kill all of us. And all of us, if we put our mind to it now, we actually have the tools to feed, house, clothe, and educate every person on the planet. We've never been here before, where one of us could kill all of us, and all of us could fix everything. What is that place? It means we've never been more godlike as a species than we are today. Well, put those two together. We've never lived more of our life in a realm that is God-free, and we have never been more godlike. What does that mean? It means that ethics and values really matter. It means every single person needs to be in the grip of sustainable values, and at a minimum, the golden rule, do unto others as you wish them to do unto you, and every faith and culture has their version of it, because you now live in a world where more people can do unto you farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. Putin did unto us in our last election, and we live in a world where we can do unto others farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. Everyone needs to be in the embrace of the golden rule. And if you're not teaching that in some way, shape, or form, you are utterly failing in your mission. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. I actually gave this part of my talk as the commencement address at Olin College of Engineering a couple of years ago. And I told the parents there, I know what you're thinking. You paid $200,000 so your kid could get an engineering degree. And who do they bring in as the commencement speaker? But a knucklehead promoting the golden rule. Is there anything more naive? And what I told them is what I will tell you. In this world, naivete is the new realism. Because I'll tell you what's really naive. What's really naive is thinking we're going to be okay when men, women, machines get this interdependent and super empowered if everyone is not in the embrace of the golden rule. Where do people learn the golden rule? Two places: healthy communities and strong families. I'm not an expert on strong families. I hope I built one, but I'd never presume to lecture anyone on that subject. But I am an expert on healthy communities because I grew up in one, a little town outside of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park. And that's why my book, after going through all this technology and all this whirlwind whiz-bang stuff, ends in the little town where I grew up and learned the golden rule. I'll save that chapter for you to read it. I'll simply conclude my talk as I conclude my book with a theme song. My book had a theme song. I actually explored whether I could buy this song. So when you opened the book, it would play this song like a Hallmark card plays Happy Birthday. The song is by one of my favorite singers, Brandi Carlile. If you watch the Grammys this year, she was featured, great singer. And she wrote a song a couple of years ago that I believe is the anthem of our time. And the song is called the I-E-Y-E. And the main refrain is, I wrapped your love around me like a chain, but I never was afraid that it would die. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you're standing in the eye. You see, my accelerations, folks, they're a hurricane. And we have leaders all over the world are trying to build a wall to the hurricane. I'm actually calling for building an eye. That's the healthy community. An eye that moves with the storm, draws energy from it, but creates a platform of dynamic stability. Not frozen stability, but dynamic stability, like riding a bike, where everyone can feel connected, protected, and respected. And I believe the great struggle in global politics going forward is going to be between the wall people and the eye people. And my book is a manifesto for the eye people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Now, after you get done assigning my book to all of your students, I'll answer a few questions before, and then I got to go. So fire away. Just tell me who you are, please, and where you're from.
I'm Xianzang from University of Hong Kong.
Well,
I was in Berkeley 9 months ago. But anyhow, that blue curve,
yeah.
human, and you use the words very carefully,
yeah.
averaged human at that
yeah, right, yeah.
Now, if you look at the broad spectrum,
sure.
that blue curve will blur.
Yes.
Will have a width that's a
yeah.
thicker line.
Yes.
Now, that thicker line, I'm interested to know, as you develop, we are departing from the technology is much faster. Now, technology, the white curve is still driven by a small fraction of
right.
so-called smart people,
yes.
tech people, right?
Yeah.
They drive it. But at the same time, that curve, because of the acceleration, that helps the average people are at
right.
the lower bound
yeah.
will move up
yes.
quickly, like concatenate, right?
Yeah.
Now, essentially, what I can use the parallel as rich people in this country or in this world pay the tax.
Yes.
The tax also helps the poor
yes.
to move up, right?
Yeah.
So we do the similar parallel in the technology
right.
arena.
Yeah.
Now, do you see actually that so-called spread of the this sort of blue curve will be narrowed down by this interaction between humans and that technology itself?
Yeah.
Or it's going to be spread further?
Yeah. I think both will happen.
Both.
Yeah. It won't be one or the other. Yeah. It'll really
You can't trust that.
Yeah.
Whether there will be a human law
right.
to help to narrow down that,
right.
or
yeah.
there's a mathematics,
right.
which I have a little faith on that.
Yeah.
But I think mathematics in the future
yeah,
may guarantee our democracy.
Yeah.
Like
okay, very interesting idea. I never thought about it.
Change the example.
Yeah.
Build the trust through
yeah.
mathematics.
Sure. I'm not necessarily a pessimist about, I just think we're so early in this. It's hard for me to give you a definitive answer. It's my instinct is often these things, both things happen, and only in time will we see which trend dominates, But it's why I believe AI can turn into IA, and that I'm not a pessimist about all of this. Thank you. Yeah, where are you from?
Peter Matson from Edinburgh. Two questions. Is there any evidence that 2007 and 2008 were connected? In other words, is there any
evidence
that 2007 and 2008 were connected?
It's a very good question. Yeah.
And then the second question is, what's your prediction for the locus of world power? Who's going to find the eye, and who's going to continue to try and build the wall?
There's been a little bit of work about 2007, 2008. Joe Stiglitz actually wrote a very interesting article with a colleague around 2009, paralleling what happened in 1929 with a leap forward in industrialization and what happened to farms and whatnot. But I didn't see anybody ever sort of pick up on that. I believe there was, but I can't I'm not a trained economist enough to do that. And the second question was,
The locus of world power.
right, who's going to kind of get this right? Well, so I'm a real optimist still about America. You know, the cliche about America is that we're a country divided between two coasts that are liberalizing, pluralizing, globalizing, diversifying, and modernizing. And then there's flyover America, where everyone's high on opioids, voted for Trump, and waiting for 1950 to come back. And that's the cliche about America. That is really wrong. You only have to be from flyover America to know that ain't true. Come with me to Minneapolis, I'll show you 2.5% unemployment. Okay. So actually, America today is a checkerboard of communities and towns that are rising from the bottom up, and communities and towns that are collapsing from the bottom down into what you're reading about: opioid abuse, suicide of less educated white males, divorce, and everything that you've been reading about. And so actually all of my work since the book came out has been trying to understand which communities are rising and which communities are falling. What do they have in common? And I can tell you what the rising communities all have in common is that they've all created complex adaptive coalitions. So I just take what Mother Nature did and I translate it into politics. So these complex adaptive coalitions are where the business community partners with the education community, partners with the philanthropic community, partners with the social entrepreneurial community, partners with the local government, and they create a coalition that can actually keep up with the pace of change. Because we live in a world now where all national governments are paralyzed by political tribalism on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, the single family is way too weak to keep up with these accelerations. So it's actually the healthy community, I believe, that is the right governing unit of the 21st century. And if you come, as I do, from a country going back to Tocqueville, it's actually built around towns and communities, a very federal system, I think you're going to have a real advantage going forward. So a lot of my work today is going around the country and identifying who's building a complex adaptive coalition. That's one thing they have in common. And the other thing, two other things they all have in common: these coalitions are led by a new political category. They're called leaders without authority. So it's people in the community who step up and say, not going to happen in my town, not going to happen in my town. And they start the network going. And the second is that they all build an inclusive culture, particularly around race and immigration. So I was just in western Minnesota 5 days ago, visiting a town called Wilmer in central Minnesota. My aunt and uncle moved there in 1949, so I haven't been going to this town for 50 years. And I never forgot that around 50 years ago, I'm 65, I probably was, 15, my aunt came from west central Minnesota down to Minneapolis, where I lived, and I never forgot this. She said to me, everybody's sitting down? Yeah, everybody's sitting down. She said, Tom, I was in the grocery store, and I heard someone speaking Spanish. 50 years ago, she said that to me. It could have been Martian. I was in the grocery store, Tom, and I heard someone speaking Martian. So I was in Wilmer last week. I started at Wilmer High School. Roughly a quarter of the class is now Somali and Latino. In a town where 50 years ago, my aunt thought Spanish was like Martian. And Wilmer is taking off. 2.2% unemployment. If you can fog up a mirror, you can get a job in Wilmer. Okay, but as a scientist or as working in the Genio turkey factory. 20 miles down the road or 30 miles is St. Cloud, going over a cliff. Can't deal with inclusion. Don't want a lot of black people around here. And if you can't deal with inclusion in this age of acceleration, you're going to die. And two towns right next door to each other. Got time? Yeah, please.
So,
Where are you from?
University of Birmingham, UK.
Great.
So you are now Vice Chancellor,
Mm-hmm.
and clearly your first priority is to make all your students buy your book. But what's your second priority?
Well, you know, I always begin by, I had a Marshall Scholarship. I was educated at Oxford, so I know a little bit about the education system over there. You cannot do anything if people don't know what world they're living in. And I think the beginning of wisdom is to simply explain to people what world you're living in. And that's what I try to do in this book. So a lot of people go into journalism for different reasons. Some want to be investigative reporters, sports reporters, political reporters. I went into journalism because I like explaining things. And it's actually, for me, my form of idealism. So I live by the motto of Marie Curie, now is the time to understand more so we may fear less. That's really the business I'm in. Because there's a lot of people today who are in another business. They're in the business of making people stupid and frightened. In fact, we have a whole network in this country devoted to that, okay? And so when people don't know what world they're living in, they can really go off and make really bad choices. And so that's the first thing I'm going to do. I want my students, by the way, in my work, it's every day I'm changing my model. I'm updating it because stuff's moving really fast, you know. But if people don't know what world they're living in, by the way, and here are the opportunities, here are the challenges, not be afraid of everything, put up a wall, you're not going to get very far, you know. And so I think that's the second thing I would do. Sit down and give people a real clear idea of what are the big trends in this world, how do I get the most out of those trends and cushion the worst. And that's what I would say to a mayor, and that's what I'd say to your prime minister. I'd say to your prime minister, disconnecting in a connected world, that's not like a really good idea, okay? So that's what I mean. If you don't start, if we don't have a common baseline, if you think this is a video player and I think it's an elephant, we're not, and that's kind of what's going on in politics today. Someone's telling people, no, that's actually an elephant. You can ride the elephant, you know. It'll take you somewhere. You can milk the elephant. No. Actually, it's just it's a video player. And so there's such a gap now between the two. That's a real problem. I got time for one more really quick one. Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, Wayne University.
Yeah.
I have a question about nationalism and technology.
Mm-hmm.
We hear a lot about 5G and how there might be sort of an Asian 5G, like China, and
Yeah.
North American 5G, or something else.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about not just 5G?
Yeah, sure. You're right. Yeah. I mean, that's I have a whole chapter in the book about geopolitics, that realm. I didn't talk about it here, but it's going to be an issue because look, there's going to be some kind of gravitation to a set of norms and standards now, because if you have a technology company, say it, you might call it, you decide to call it Huawei. And your technology company develops a reputation for violating people's privacy because people think it's actually government run. You will lose business everywhere. You won't just lose business in Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And so there's going to be standards. You know, people can't trust that. Look what's going on at Facebook. So I did a column a while back, and I'll end on this, you know, where it was with David Coleman, who runs the College Board. He's a very good friend of mine. And I don't know if you saw this, but he and Stephanie Sanford decided for the SAT-2s, there's actually two things every high school student, many things they should know. There are two things they must know. And they've created, reshaped the SATs around, 2s around this. They think every student graduating high school should know two codes: how to code a computer and the code of the US Constitution. And Mark Zuckerberg is a walking, living, breathing example of someone who took the first course and didn't take the second. And if the folks at Huawei just took the first course and didn't take the second, they're going to have the same problem that Mark Zuckerberg is running into. Got to run. Thanks very much. Thank you.